A billionaire arrives to pick up his son from school and is shocked to see a black janitor walking with him. "Get your hands off my son, Thomas." Hartwell's furious shout thundered across the courtyard of the prestigious Winchester Academy, snapping heads around. The billionaire real estate mogul charged forward like an enraged bull toward the black man in a blue janitor's uniform who was holding the hand of 8-year-old Tommy, his son. Alexander Washington didn't let go of the boy's hand. Instead, he calmly stepped in front of him, shielding the child from his father's rage. His steady gaze stood in stark contrast to the storm exploding in front of him. "Mr. Hartwell, I can explain what," Thomas spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Why a janitor has his hands on my son, security." At 42, Alexander had lived through this scene countless times. The disgust in their eyes, the accusatory tone, the unspoken assumption that his presence near a wealthy white child could only mean something sinister. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just an invisible janitor being humiliated in front of a crowd. Tommy, frightened and confused, clutched Alexander's hand tighter. "Dad, Mr. Alexander was helping me. I fell, and quiet Tommy Thomas snapped, yanking his son back. "I don't ever want you near that kind of person again." Other parents began gathering, whispering among themselves, phones already raised to capture photos. Principal Campbell rushed over, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Hartwell, please calm down. We can resolve this." "Calm down." Thomas barked a bitter laugh. "I see a stranger putting his hands on my son, and you expect me to calm down? This man shouldn't even be allowed on campus." Alexander drew in a deep breath. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anger he kept contained, the kind most men would have lost long ago. 20 years as a pediatric neurosurgeon before his downfall had taught him to steady himself even in the most life-or-death situations. "You're right, Mr. Hartwell," Alexander said, his calm voice startling those around him. "Maybe I shouldn't be here, but your son split his forehead when he fell, and as a former doctor, I simply gave him basic first aid." The silence that followed seemed to crackle in the air. Thomas blinked, struggling to process the phrase "former doctor." But arrogance smothered reason. "Former doctor," he scoffed. "And I suppose I used to be an astronaut. Save those lies for someone gullible enough to believe them." The crowd buzzed louder. Some parents looked uneasy, but none dared challenge Thomas Hartwell, the school's golden benefactor, donating millions each year. Alexander scanned the faces around him, memorizing every glance, every silent witness complicit in his public humiliation. Yet in his eyes was a strange serenity that made more than one person shiver. "I understand your reaction completely, Mr. Hartwell," Alexander said, wiping his hands on his uniform. "After all, it's only natural for a parent to be concerned when someone like me is near their child. But remember, our conversation is far from over." He turned and walked toward the supply room, head held high with a dignity that gnawed at Thomas's bones. Here, in the glare of disdain and pity, Alexander Washington carried a secret powerful enough to turn this act of public humiliation into the greatest lesson injustice Winchester's elite had ever witnessed. If this story of prejudice and turning points stirs something in you, don't forget to subscribe. Watch how a man the world dismissed as just a janitor rewrites the rules in ways no arrogant billionaire could ever forget. News of the uproar at Winchester Academy spread like wildfire through local elite WhatsApp groups. Thomas Hartwell wasted no time. Before he even reached home, he had already called 3 members of the school board, demanding the immediate dismissal of the dangerous janitor. "Principal Campbell, I want a clear explanation of how you hire your staff." Thomas barked over the phone from the school parking lot. "My son was nearly abducted by a suspicious man." The next morning, Alexander arrived at work to find the atmosphere completely changed. His colleagues' eyes wavered between pity and suspicion. Some who used to greet him now avoided his gaze, afraid of being caught in the fallout. Supervisor Martinez was waiting for him in the storage room, clipboard in hand, her face set in stern lines. "Alexander, we need to talk. There have been some concerns about your behavior with the students." "Concerns?" Alexander asked evenly, still arranging the cleaning tools with the precision of a surgeon, a habit that had never left him since his days in the operating theater. "Several parents have called in questioning whether it's appropriate for staff to have close contact with the children." She avoided his gaze. "Perhaps it would be best if you focused on strictly administrative duties for now." Alexander gave a quiet nod. 23 years ago, he had lost his medical license after being accused of negligence in a surgery. The patient was the son of a powerful politician who died from complications no one could have foreseen. But a black neurosurgeon from a poor background was the perfect scapegoat when the elite needed someone to take the fall. Back then, he fought desperately to clear his name, pouring every dollar into lawyers. He lost his home, his wife, his reputation, and he learned a bitter truth. Society does not only punish the guilty, it punishes anyone who dares to step into spaces where they're told they don't belong. But this time would be different. He was no longer the naive young doctor who believed skill and integrity were enough to overcome prejudice. Meanwhile, Thomas was savoring his victory. Over lunch at the golf club, he relished telling the story to his business friends, adding more flair with every sentence. Can you believe it? Some janitor, probably an ex-con, had the nerve to put his hands on my boy. Good thing I showed up when I did. You did the right thing. Thomas Peterson, his business partner, agreed. People like that need to remember their place. But Thomas had no idea that Alexander had already begun his own investigation. During his late-night shifts at the school, he noticed something peculiar. Thomas often arrived late, leaving Tommy waiting alone for up to 40 minutes. More than once, Alexander found the boy crying quietly in the empty playground. Even more troubling were the phone calls Thomas made right outside the school gates. With ears sharpened by years in the operating room, Alexander caught fragments of alarming conversations. The forged documents are ready. The audit won't catch a thing. If anyone leaks, you know what to do. 3 days after the incident, Alexander received a summons to the police station to give testimony. Thomas had filed a formal complaint accusing him of suspicious and inappropriate behavior with a minor. Within hours, Alexander's photo was circulating in neighborhood social media groups tagged with warnings about a dangerous predator lurking nearby. At the station, Chief Santos, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, proceeded with the questioning as protocol required. Mr. Washington, you understand we're obliged to investigate any allegation involving a child, don't you? Completely, Officer, Alexander replied with the same calm he once used to explain complex surgeries to anxious families. In fact, I'd like to take this opportunity to report my own concerns regarding the child in question. The officer raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Alexander pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket, an old medical habit he had never abandoned. Tommy Hartwell shows clear signs of emotional neglect and possible psychological abuse. Panic attacks, social withdrawal, and extreme fear of his father's reactions. The precision of his terminology and his professional demeanor left the deputy chief visibly taken aback. This was clearly not an ordinary janitor. Meanwhile, at home, Thomas was gloating to his wife Victoria about how he had dealt with the problem at school. That guy will know better than to stick his nose where it doesn't belong, Thomas said as he poured himself a $500 glass of scotch. But Victoria wasn't convinced. Thomas, are you sure you didn't overreact? Tommy said the man was just helping him. Tommy's just a child, Victoria. He doesn't understand the dangers out there. I'm protecting my son from a man who could very well be a predator. What neither of them knew was that Alexander had begun recording every interaction at school with a hidden app on his phone. 23 years of injustice had taught him that in a world where his word would always weigh less than his skin color, evidence was the only shield he had. And those recordings of Thomas's conversations in the school parking lot didn't just expose prejudice, they revealed crimes serious enough to put the arrogant billionaire behind bars. Every insult, every humiliation only fed a force within Alexander that his oppressors could never see a quiet power forged in the very injustice they inflicted. The privileged had no idea that with every contemptuous gesture they were writing their own downfall. And Alexander Washington was meticulously keeping record of every single word in that sentence. 2 weeks after Thomas called the police, Alexander was still faithfully working his night shifts at Winchester Academy when his phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen from a number that had disappeared more than 2 decades ago. Dr. Washington, this is Patricia Niez. I need to see you urgently. I just read the news. Patricia had been a resident physician back when Alexander was still performing surgeries at the major medical center. She was one of the very few who had placed her absolute trust in his innocence when his medical license was stripped away. Now she was among this nation's most respected pediatric neurosurgeons, serving as chief medical officer at a leading West Coast hospital. They met in a quiet downtown cafe. Patricia, elegant in a dark blazer, could barely conceal her outrage. Alexander, when I saw your name in the local paper with that accusation of misconduct, I nearly smashed my phone in anger. Thomas Hartwell has no idea who he's dealing with. Patty, you know how the system works? Alexander replied, calmly stirring his coffee. The story was written long before it was printed. A failed black doctor, now a suspicious janitor. No, not if you don't let them define you that way, Patricia shot back, sliding a thick folder across the table. I pulled copies of your original medical records letters of recommendation, handwritten thank you notes from families you saved, and your published research in international journals. Everything that was buried back then. Alexander opened the folder. His eyes misted as he looked at the faces of children he had once saved, the heartfelt letters scrawled by grateful parents, and the research he had devoted his life to, all erased because of a baseless accusation. That's not all, Patricia continued. Do you remember Dr. Martinez from the Ethics Board? He once cleared you of all wrongdoing before political pressure intervened. He's retired now, but he still has the complete records and is willing to testify about the misconduct in your case. Meanwhile, Thomas Hartwell was gloating over his so-called triumph at a business meeting at the golf club. Can you believe it? Some janitor actually had the nerve to stand up to me in front of my son. Well, he knows his place now. What Thomas didn't know was that Alexander had already begun his own investigation into the Hartwell empire, with the same meticulous precision he once applied in the operating room. Never losing a patient, he unearthed chilling truths about Thomas's financial dealings. Through public records and Patricia's network of contacts, Alexander discovered that Hartwell's companies were running a tangled web of tax evasion and money laundering. Even more alarming medical records showed that Thomas's son had been hospitalized 3 times in a single year for domestic accidents, a pattern no physician could dismiss as normal. On his night shifts, Alexander began systematically documenting Thomas's behavior at the school. A small recorder hidden in his uniform captured every phone call the tycoon made in the parking lot, every insult hurled at staff, every moment he neglected his own child. The tapes revealed a man utterly different from the polished image Thomas projected. If the auditors ever find those Cayman accounts, I'm finished, Thomas hissed into the phone. And that lawyer poking around factory conditions, we need to shut her up before she stirs trouble. 3 days later, Alexander received an unexpected visitor at his doorstep. Standing there was young Tommy Hartwell, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Uncle Alexander, my dad says you're a bad man, but you're always nice to me. He hurts me when he gets mad. Alexander's heart clenched. His medical instincts confirmed what he had long feared. The bruises on Tommy's arms, the fear in his gaze, the accidents repeating over and over again. Tommy, can you tell me what happens at home? The boy broke down, confessing a nightmare, a cycle of physical and emotional abuse. Thomas beat him when drunk, locked him in his room for hours as punishment, and tore him down with venomous words, telling him he was weak, worthless, a disappointment. His mother, Victoria, knew but was too terrified to act. Alexander immediately called Patricia. I need you to examine a child quietly. I suspect abuse. My God, Alexander, are you certain? I have 23 years of pediatric trauma experience. I know these signs. Meanwhile, Thomas pressed forward with his smear campaign, spreading rumors among the Parents' Association and urging them to shun the dangerous janitor. He even hired a private investigator to dig into Alexander's past. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance was weaving the very noose that would tighten around his own neck. Every threat, every insult, every act of prejudice was being logged by a man who once worked in operating rooms where life and death hinged on each deliberate move. Patricia assembled a covert team, a child psychologist, a civil rights attorney, even an investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. All volunteered, bound together by shared outrage at the injustice Alexander had endured. We now have enough evidence to destroy Thomas Hartwell on 3 fronts, Patricia declared in a closed-door meeting: child abuse, financial crime, and racial discrimination. The question is, how do we proceed? Alexander stared quietly out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. 23 years ago, he had been a young doctor who naively believed that truth alone was enough. This time, he would not make that mistake again. We're not just after justice, Alexander said calmly. We need to make sure he never gets the chance to hurt anyone again. At Winchester Academy, Thomas carried on with his usual arrogance, completely unaware that every move was being tracked and recorded by a man society had once dismissed as invisible. That invisible man was about to teach him the true meaning of power, the power of someone who had nothing left to lose but everything to prove. Never had Winchester Academy seen a press conference like this. Just 24 hours earlier, Alexander Washington had been nothing more than a janitor under investigation. Now he sat with quiet authority beside Dr. Patricia Neas, veteran investigative journalist, Michael Torres, and a stack of documents that any prosecutor would kill to have. At exactly 9 a.m., Thomas Hartwell drove into the parking lot as usual, barking into his phone about a minor nuisance with a troublesome employee. But his swagger evaporated the moment he saw the swarm of reporters and cameras waiting at the school gates. "Mr. Hartwell," a reporter shouted, "is it true your company evaded more than $15 million in taxes over the last 3 years?" Thomas's face drained of color. He spun around to retreat to his car, only to be cut off by another pack of reporters circling like sharks who had smelled blood. "Mr. Hartwell, how do you respond to allegations that you abused your own son?" Another voice pressed a microphone shoved inches from his face. Inside the school, Alexander stood at the window, calm and steady, as if preparing for brain surgery. Beside him, Patricia held a set of x-rays she had secretly taken of Tommy, irrefutable evidence of multiple fractures at different stages of healing. "Phase 1 is complete," Alexander murmured. "Now the whole world knows who Thomas Hartwell really is." But the brilliance of the plan was only beginning to unfold. As Thomas stammered denials into the cameras, his phone vibrated. On the line was his chief accountant voice, frantic. "Thomas, the IRS is here with a search warrant. They've got recordings of your calls about the Cayman accounts." How could they possibly have that? Thomas felt his knees buckle. The recordings, those private conversations he had in the school parking lot. And then a dreadful memory struck that janitor who was always sweeping nearby whenever he made his riskiest calls. That bastard. Thomas muttered the truth, hitting him like a punch to the gut. Michael Torres stepped forward with a triumphant smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I have here a USB drive with 47 recordings of you discussing tax evasion, bribing auditors, and intimidating witnesses." Care to comment? Alexander's strategy was brutally simple and entirely legal. For months, he had recorded Thomas's calls made in public spaces, right in the school parking lot. As a former surgeon, Alexander knew the laws on privacy and evidentiary standards inside and out. Every tape was obtained within legal bounds. "This is entrapment," Thomas roared, sweat streaming down his forehead. "You can't use those recordings." "Actually, we can," replied the civil rights attorney. Patricia had brought in her tone even and measured. "There is no expectation of privacy in public spaces, and given that your own words expose crimes that endangered a child, it is our ethical duty to make them public." At that moment, Victoria Hartwell appeared with Tommy. The boy ran straight into Alexander's arms, clinging to him tightly, ignoring the father who was being exposed just steps away. Uncle Alexander, Tommy sobbed, burying his face in the man who had freed him from his private hell. Dr. Patricia said, "I don't have to be scared anymore." The cameras captured everything. The natural trust of a child toward the suspicious janitor stood in stark contrast to the terror he showed in the presence of his billionaire father. Victoria, tears streaming down her cheeks, stepped forward before the press. I knew what was happening at home," her voice trembled, "but I was too afraid to speak out. This man," she pointed to Alexander, "saved my son, while my husband accused him of being dangerous. He was the only one who truly cared about Tommy's safety." The parents of Winchester Academy, who just weeks earlier had whispered about the troublesome janitor, now watched in stunned silence as the truth unfolded like a horror film. Thomas launched one last desperate attack. "You people believe the word of a janitor over me. I built an empire. And he's just a Dr. Alexander Washington." Patricia cut him off, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "Pediatric neurosurgeon, Harvard Medical School graduate summa cum laude, author of 17 peer-reviewed papers on pediatric brain trauma, a man who saved over 200 children before being discredited and stripped of his license under political pressure." The room went still. Thomas blinked rapidly as if unable to process the revelation. 23 years ago, Alexander said calmly, stepping toward the cameras, "I learned that society doesn't just punish crimes, it punishes those who dare to step into places it believes they don't belong." Today I'm teaching a different lesson. True power doesn't come from money or influence. It comes from the patience of those who know how to wait for the right moment to let justice prevail. Just then, Thomas's phone rang again. It was his partner Peterson, voice shaking with panic. Thomas, clients are canceling contracts left and right. The board wants you to resign immediately. Stocks just dropped 80%. Thomas collapsed to the ground. His legs could no longer carry the crushing weight of his downfall. In less than 2 hours, he had lost his company, his family, his freedom, and the last shred of dignity he thought he had. Alexander knelt down, leaned close, and whispered so only Thomas could hear. Next time you judge someone by how they look, remember sometimes the janitor is the smartest man in the room. Thomas was carried away first in an ambulance, said to be suffering a panic attack, then later in a police van. Meanwhile, Alexander remained standing in the school courtyard, holding Tommy's hand tight, surrounded by a sea of cameras. But the story wasn't over, because while the world had just witnessed the spectacular fall of an arrogant billionaire, one question lingered. What happens when a brilliant man, once crushed by the system, finally decides to use his knowledge and patience, not just for revenge, but to transform the very society that tried to erase him? 6 months later, Winchester Academy was unrecognizable. The Hartwell scandal had become a national case study taught in law schools as a perfect example of how systemic prejudice could be dismantled by the very people it tried to silence through nothing but the law. Alexander Washington no longer pushed a mop down the hallways. He now sat in the office once belonging to Principal Campbell, fired after an investigation revealed she had ignored multiple reports about Thomas's abuse. The new plaque on the door read Dr. Alexander Washington, Director of Child Protection and Academic Development. A sweet paradox. The man once considered too dangerous to be near children was now responsible for safeguarding every child in the most prestigious school in the city. As for Thomas Hartwell, he finally understood what gravity really meant. His empire had collapsed. Clients had abandoned him like rats fleeing a sinking ship the moment the recordings were made public. His bank accounts were frozen by the IRS. His mansion auctioned off to pay debts. Worst of all, he was serving a 5-year sentence for tax evasion, fraud, and child abuse. In federal prison, Thomas learned a bitter truth behind bars: the number of zeros in your bank account means nothing. His arrogance and prejudice made him the perfect target for other inmates, men who had no tolerance for someone who had hurt a child. Ironic, isn't it? Patricia remarked one afternoon, visiting Alexander in his new office. He spent his whole life judging people by skin color and social status. Now in prison, none of that matters anymore. Tommy, now free from the nightmare of his father's home, had blossomed like a young tree, finally reaching sunlight after years in the shadows. Victoria had divorced Thomas just before the trial ended, reclaiming her independence and her courage. Together, mother and son now lived in a modest but peaceful home, something Thomas's fortune had never been able to provide. But the most touching thing was this: every time Tommy saw Alexander in the school halls, he would sprint toward him with pure joy, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Dr. Alexander! Dr. Alexander!" The child who once lived in fear now radiated joy and confidence. Alexander had done more than avenge himself. He had transformed the very culture of Winchester Academy. He implemented diversity programs, enforced strict anti-discrimination policies, and above all created an environment where every child from any background felt safe to speak up against any form of abuse. The reinstatement of his medical license was only the beginning. Universities across the nation invited Alexander to lecture on how injustice can be turned into a force for social change. Publishers competed for the rights to his memoir. Hollywood producers wanted to bring his life story to the big screen. But perhaps the sweetest revenge came during the Academy's annual board meeting. The very parents who once whispered disdain about the dangerous janitor now scrambled to shake his hand to take selfies with Dr. Washington. "It's astonishing how quickly people can change their minds," Patricia remarked, her sarcasm barely masking her contempt for the hypocrisy of the wealthy elite. Alexander only smiled calmly, the same composure that had unsettled Thomas from the very first day. "They haven't changed their opinion of me. They've only just discovered who I always was." Linda Holloway, the socialite who once led the campaign against Alexander, now avoided public gatherings. Even her old circle of friends abandoned her, not so much out of moral conviction, but because standing beside her meant standing on the wrong side of a story that had become a national symbol of justice. Winchester Academy had become a model for others. Delegations from private schools frequently visited to study the Washington Code. a framework of principles Alexander had drafted to prevent discrimination and to protect staff at every level. One afternoon, as Alexander reviewed reports in his office, he received an unexpected letter. It was from Thomas, written on cheap prison paper with a trembling hand. Dr. Washington, it began, and Alexander immediately noticed Thomas had finally addressed him with the proper title. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but you should know that I finally understand who you really are. Not only a brilliant doctor, but a better man than I will ever be. My son is happy for the first time in his life, and it's all because of you. Thank you for saving him, from me. Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about truth. Sometimes a man has to lose everything before he can see it. Tommy poked his head into the office just as he did every afternoon after school. Dr. Alexander, can I do my homework here today? Of course, young man, Alexander replied, clearing a space on the desk. How was science class? It was awesome. Tommy beamed. The teacher said, When I grow up, I could be a doctor, just like you. Alexander watched the boy open his books with excitement. A child who once lived, haunted by fear, now dreamed of the future. That transformation was worth more than any revenge. 6 months ago, Thomas Hartwell thought he was humiliating a black janitor. In truth, he had awakened a sleeping giant, a man who knew his worth and who had the patience and intellect to prove it to the world. The lesson could not be clearer: never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes the quiet janitor is the most powerful man in the room. And when someone tries to diminish you with prejudice, remember the best revenge is not stooping to their level, but rising so high they must look up just to see you. Thomas had tried to destroy Alexander, but in the end only destroyed himself. Alexander had learned that true revenge isn't about returning the pain your enemy gave you. It's about achieving a success they could never have imagined. And if this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe for more stories that prove in the end, truth always wins, no matter how long it takes.